Colombia has 800 miles of Pacific coastline, roughly the length of California's coastline, and almost nobody lives on it. The Caribbean side is packed with cities. The Pacific side is a wall of green with barely a road. That emptiness isn't an accident, and the biggest reason isn't the jungle. Look at a satellite image of Colombia at night, and you'll see a country split in two. The Caribbean coast glows. Cartagena, Barranquilla, Santa Marta, a string of cities throwing light across the northern shoreline. Then swing your eye west and south, down the Pacific side, and the screen goes dark. Not dim, dark. 800 miles of coastline belonging to a country of over 50 million people, and from space, it looks uninhabited. The first thing you need to understand about Colombia's Pacific coast is that it is, by almost any measure, one of the wettest places human beings have ever tried to live. And wet here operates on a scale that wrecks your frame of reference. Seattle is America's poster child for rain. Everybody pictures the gray skies, the drizzle, the coffee dependency. Seattle gets about 37 inches of rain a year. The city of Quibdó, capital of Colombia's Chaco department, the largest department on the Pacific coast, gets over 400 inches. That's not a typo. Quibdó receives roughly 11 times more rain than Seattle every single year. And that's the capital, the biggest settlement in the region. A town called Loro, about 14 miles southeast of Quibdó, has recorded rainfall estimates closer to 524 inches a year, staking a claim as the wettest inhabited place on Earth. And it doesn't come in seasons. That's the part that changes everything. In most tropical climates, you get a wet season and a dry season, months where the roads harden and people can build, farm, and move. In the Chaco, it rains more than 300 days a year. There is no dry season. There is a slightly less wet season, and then the rest of the calendar, which is essentially a months-long downpour with brief intermissions. The reason is the mountains. The Western Cordillera, one of 3 branches of the Andes that slice through Colombia, rises directly to the east of the Pacific lowlands. When warm, moisture-heavy air rolls in off the Pacific Ocean, it hits that mountain wall and has nowhere to go but up. As it climbs, it cools, and all that moisture drops. Every single day. The mountains don't just sit next to the rain, they cause it. And because the Cordillera runs roughly parallel to the coast for hundreds of miles, the entire Pacific lowland gets caught in the same trap, a narrow strip of land pinned between an ocean that feeds the moisture and a mountain range that squeezes it out. What that volume of water does to the ground is the real story. This isn't a coast of sandy beaches and palm-lined shores. Most of Colombia's Pacific shoreline is tangled mangrove, dense root systems that blur the line between land and sea. Move inland and the ground doesn't get firmer, it gets swampier. The Atrato River, one of the most powerful rivers in South America, drains a basin of roughly 14,600 square miles through the northern half of this coast. Its discharge is enormous, so much water pushing so much sediment that it's physically filling in the Gulf of Urabá at its mouth. Along much of the river's course, the landscape is permanent wetland. Not flooded after a storm wetland. Permanently saturated ground that hasn't been dry in recorded memory. Try to build a road through that. The soil can't hold a foundation. Pavement laid in the dry weeks gets undercut and washed out before the next dry weeks arrive. Bridges rot. Any clearing cut for farmland or construction gets swallowed by vegetation within a single growing cycle, and in a place where the growing cycle never stops, that means months, not years. The jungle doesn't reclaim the land. It never really left. Here's what makes this counterintuitive. The same conditions that block human settlement create one of the most biologically dense environments on the planet. The Chaco bioregion is considered a global biodiversity hotspot. The forces that make this coast almost impossible to develop are the forces that make it explode with life. And for centuries, the people who did live on this coast adapted to the water instead of fighting it. The rivers were the roads. Communities settled along the Atrato and its hundreds of tributaries, traveling by canoe, growing what they could, fishing the rivers and the coast. It worked for a subsistence economy. Canoes can carry people and plantains. They can't carry industrial equipment or the supply chains a modern economy requires. River transport doesn't scale. It doesn't build hospitals or stock pharmacies. And so the population stayed small, because the infrastructure that could support a larger one was never going to arrive by water alone. The numbers are stark. The Chaco, the biggest piece of the Pacific coast, covers nearly 18,000 square miles. That's larger than Switzerland. Its population in the most recent census was roughly 535,000 people, about 30 people per square mile. New Jersey packs in over 1,000. Even Montana, one of the emptiest states in the US, has about 7.5. For a tropical coastal department in a country of 52 million, those numbers are staggering. But rain and swamp alone don't empty a coastline. Southeast Asia is drenched. Bangladesh floods every year and holds 170 million people. The physical geography made Colombia's Pacific coast hard to live on. Something else made it easy to ignore. And that something started 500 years ago, when the people with the money and the ships showed up and looked the other way. The obvious guess is that Spain, the empire that crossed oceans, toppled civilizations, and mined silver out of mountains at 13,000 feet, simply couldn't handle a rainy coast. That's not what happened. Spain didn't fail to conquer the Pacific lowlands. Spain looked at them, did the math, and chose the other side. When the first Spanish colonizers arrived in the early 1500s, they found a country with two coasts and one obvious answer. The Caribbean side had calm, navigable waters. It had natural harbors, and it faced east toward Spain. Cartagena was founded in 1533 and within decades became one of the most important ports in the empire, a fortified staging ground for gold, silver, and enslaved people moving across the Atlantic. Santa Marta, a bit further east, had already been established in 1525. Bogota was founded in 1538, planted in the cool highlands where the elevation killed tropical diseases and the valleys supported agriculture year-round. Connecting all of it was the Magdalena River, Colombia's spine. The Magdalena flows roughly 930 miles from the Andes to the Caribbean, running north between two mountain chains like a highway drawn by geology. For the entire colonial period, it was the only practical route linking Bogota to the outside world. Everything Spain wanted out of Colombia, and everything it needed to send in, traveled the Magdalena to the Caribbean coast and across the Atlantic. That's the direction the money flowed. That's the direction infrastructure followed. The Pacific coast pointed the wrong way. It faced west, into an ocean that led to nothing Spain needed. No trade routes to Asia, no major harbors for large galleons, rougher waters, mangrove, shoreline, and an interior that ate roads. The Caribbean gave them everything faster and cheaper. But Spain did use the Pacific coast for one thing, and this is the part that determines who lives there today. Starting in the 1600s, mining families from cities like Popayan and Cali pushed into the Chaco to extract gold. The region turned out to be one of the richest mineral zones in the Americas. Gold washed out of Andean rivers and deposited in the lowland streams. To work those mines, the Spanish brought enslaved Africans. By the late 1700s, a colonial census counted fewer than 400 white residents in the entire Chaco. The rest, roughly 17,000 people, were enslaved Africans, indigenous communities, and freed former slaves. The gold left. The people stayed. When slavery was abolished in 1851, the Afro-Colombian communities along the Pacific rivers didn't suddenly gain infrastructure or government attention. They were free, but free in the single most isolated region of the country, in a place the colonial economy had treated as a mine and the Republic treated as an afterthought. They built their own systems: fishing, small-scale farming, river trade, cultural traditions drawing on West African roots. Today, Afro-Colombians make up roughly 90% of the Pacific Coast population. In the Chaco, the figure is around 85%. The demographic map is a direct artifact of the colonial mining economy. People brought there by force and left in place when the mines stopped producing. And here's the twist that sealed it. In 1903, Panama separated from Colombia. The split was backed by the United States, which wanted the isthmus to build the canal. Before 1903, Panama was Colombian territory. The potential for a Pacific to Atlantic corridor, the single greatest strategic advantage the Pacific coast could have offered, vanished. The canal was built on Panamanian soil, under American control, and Colombia lost the one piece of geography that might have forced it to invest in its western coastline. It's not a coincidence that the Darien Gap, the famous missing link in the Pan-American Highway, sits at the northern end of this same coast. The same forces that emptied the coast killed the highway. So by the 20th century, the map was drawn. The Caribbean coast had cities with centuries of infrastructure. The Andean interior had Bogota, Medellin, Cali. The Pacific coast had Buenaventura, a port town that existed mainly as the shortest route from the Cauca Valley to the ocean. The emptiness wasn't nature alone. It was inherited. Every road the Spanish didn't build, every rail line the Republic didn't extend, those absences compounded. Each decade without infrastructure made the next decade's investment more expensive and less appealing. But colonial neglect doesn't make a coast permanently empty. Brazil carved Brasilia out of nothing. Chile pushed the Carretera Austral through Patagonia. Why didn't Colombia simply build its way to the Pacific? The answer involves a road, one specific road, that tells you everything. Colombia's Pacific coast is, for practical purposes, an island. It just happens to be attached to the mainland. The Chaco department has exactly two main highways. One connects Quibdó to Medellin. The other connects Quibdó to Pereira. Both cross mountainous terrain, both regularly shut down from landslides, and neither one reaches the coastline. If you want to get from Quibdó to any Pacific shore town, you go by river or air. No highway foundation has been seriously worked on in the region since the late 1960s. Some indigenous communities have no choice but to canoe to Quibdó. That trip can take 2 days to a week. Think about what that means. A medical emergency in coastal Choco means getting in a boat and traveling hours, sometimes a full day, to reach a facility that may lack supplies. When every bag of rice, every bottle of medicine arrives by boat or small aircraft, prices climb. Quibdó is roughly 340 miles from Bogota. By air, the flight takes about an hour and 15 minutes. By bus, over 17 hours when the road is open. Bogota to Cartagena, a similar distance, takes 90 minutes by air, with highways that make overland travel routine. The Caribbean coast was built for connection. The Pacific coast was built for nothing. And then there's Buenaventura, the fact that makes the whole situation feel less like neglect and more like a riddle. Buenaventura handles roughly 60% of Colombia's seaborne trade. Coffee, sugar, manufactured goods, imported grain, a majority of what enters or leaves the country by ship passes through its docks. The port is critical to the national economy. By any rational accounting, Buenaventura should be one of the best funded cities in Colombia. It is one of the poorest. Over 80% of its roughly 400,000 residents live in poverty. Unemployment has been estimated as high as 66%. Entire neighborhoods lack drinkable water. The city's name, Buenaventura, meaning good fortune, reads like a joke nobody's laughing at. The port makes the country rich. The city stays poor. The wealth passes through like cargo on a conveyor belt, and almost none of it stops. The road connecting Buenaventura to Cali crosses the western Cordillera through terrain that's perpetually unstable. Landslides close it. Armed groups have historically made it perilous. Billions in international trade travel this road, and for decades it has functioned like a dirt track propping up a supermarket, structurally inadequate and patched rather than rebuilt. This is the feedback loop. The coast is empty because there's no infrastructure, and there's no infrastructure because the coast is empty. Building through the Cordillera is enormously expensive. and the political calculus in Bogota has always pointed toward more voters and more return elsewhere. Infrastructure projects have been announced, started, and abandoned. The rain comes, the money runs out, the political cycle turns, and the jungle takes it back. But roads and rain don't explain everything. Plenty of isolated, poor places hold on to their populations. Colombia's Pacific coast didn't just stagnate in recent decades, it lost people. And the force that pushed them out wasn't geography. It was deliberate, it was armed, and it found the emptiness extremely useful. Colombia has one of the largest internally displaced populations on Earth, over 7 million people forced from their homes. Roughly 1 out of every 7 Colombians has been displaced at some point. And the Pacific coast has been ground zero for a disproportionate share of that displacement. The logic is almost mechanical. The coast is isolated, with no road network for the military to patrol. Communities are scattered along rivers, reachable only by boat. The shoreline faces the open Pacific, the most direct route for moving cocaine north towards Central America. For armed groups, the emptiness is the product. Ungoverned space, minimal law enforcement, dozens of river exits to the sea, and a civilian population too scattered to resist. During the decades of Colombia's armed conflict, the Pacific Coast departments, Choco, Nariño, Cauca, and the coastal fringe of Valle del Cauca became contested territory. FARC operated there. ELN operated there. Paramilitaries moved in. Drug trafficking organizations layered on top. The International Crisis Group estimated that by the late 2010s, roughly 45% of Colombia's cocaine exports were departing from the Pacific coast. Control of a river mouth or a stretch of mangrove wasn't symbolic. It was worth millions. The civilians caught in this paid the way civilians always do, not in headlines, but in silence. In 2002, in the town of Bojaya in Choco, a battle between the FARC and paramilitaries spilled into a church where hundreds had taken shelter. A crude mortar round hit the building. As many as 119 people were killed, dozens of them children. It remains one of the worst single massacres of Colombia's internal conflict, and it happened in a place most Colombians couldn't find on a map. Bojaya was the most visible atrocity, but the constant grinding displacement was the real demographic force. People left, walked out of Pacific Coast villages, and moved to Cali, Medellin, and Bogota. Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities absorbed the heaviest losses. Every family that left took one more reason to invest in the coast with them. The region shrank, and the shrinking made it easier for armed groups to operate, which drove more people out. Then came the 2016 peace deal with the FARC. On paper, the turning point. The FARC demobilized, and the promise was that the state would move into the vacuum. It didn't work, not here. The FARC's departure created a scramble. The ELN expanded into former FARC zones. Dissident factions regrouped. The Gulf Clan pushed into Chaco. In Nariño, fighting among rival groups displaced over 23,000 people in the first 8 months of 2021 alone. In 2024, clashes in Chaco, Cauca, and Nariño displaced more than 34,000 between January and July. The violence didn't end. It reorganized. And here's the layer most outsiders never hear about. In 1993, Colombia passed Law 70, a landmark granting Afro-Colombian communities collective title to ancestral lands. Today, roughly 84% of Pacific region land falls under these arrangements. The law was progressive. It recognized centuries of habitation, protected communities from having land sold from under them, and gave legal standing to people the state had ignored. But collectively titled land can't be easily bought, sold, or developed privately. That protects communities from displacement by real estate. But it also means outside investors and employers face barriers, which, in a region that desperately needs jobs, creates another brake on the growth that might give people a reason to stay. Whether Law 70 protects the coast or traps, it depends on who you ask, and both sides have a point. So here's what Colombia's Pacific Coast actually is. Not a place that was forgotten. A place where every force, terrain, rain, colonial trade routes, infrastructure neglect, armed conflict, displacement, and even the laws designed to protect its people, pushed in the same direction. Away. Pull up that satellite image one more time. The Caribbean coast glowing with cities. The Pacific coast dark. That darkness is an absence. It's accumulation. 500 years of decisions, disasters, and geography stacking on top of each other, each layer making the next one heavier. The rain didn't just fall on the land. It fell on the roads that were never built, on the schools that were never staffed, on the families that were never given a reason to stay. The question isn't why so few people live on Colombia's west coast. The question is what it would take, what combination of roads, security, investment, and political will to finally reverse a current that's been flowing in one direction since before the country had a